Please like this video and subscribe to the channel.
Greetings, family, and welcome back to Raising the Vibe. As always, I thank you so much for joining me for yet another video. In this video, I would like to talk about what the U.S. is doing in Zimbabwe. It's absolutely crazy. But before we get into it, I'm going to ask, as always, that if you're not already subscribed to the channel, that you hit that subscribe button and that you click the thumbs up for this video. Now let's get into it. So Zimbabwe is saying that 4 U.S. nationals who were contracted by the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is USAID, covertly sneaked into their country in February without notifying authorities in Zimbabwe. They're saying that all 4 of these U.S. nationals who are women work for a U.S. government affiliate called Navanti Group. And the Zimbabwean government is saying that that team of 4 U.S. nationals was busted and deported from the country on February 17th after it was determined that the real reason they were in the country was to try and obtain an effective method of seeking a regime change in Zimbabwe. Take a look at this clip. Now, the Zimbabwean government points out that that team of 4 entered the country without notifying the government, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention. And they said that only after they discovered that the team was being shadowed did the U.S. Embassy, on behalf of Navanti Group, notify the government of that team's presence. However, they only notified the Zimbabwean government that 2 members of the team had arrived in the country, and they did not report that the remaining 2 of the 4 were also in the country. Okay? They said that the remaining 2 arrived in the country separately on February 5th, and that was kept under wraps. And that once those 2 arrived in the country, they began to hold secret meetings with the leaders of anti-government organizations, some senior opposition figures, and Western diplomats. And then this article starts telling us that these individuals engaged in a plethora of meetings. Look at the next clip. I've highlighted some of the dates. They're just meeting with folks day after day, more than one meeting on one day. And the Zimbabwean government said that overall the team had more than 12 secret meetings, and that the government has since confirmed that that team was on a covert political mission. The rest of the article is essentially quotes from the presidential communications officer, and you have got to hear how boldly he was rejecting the US's efforts to interfere in the politics of Zimbabwe. He tells us, and I'm going to read some of this language because they are not playing. He said that the failure to timely report that that team had arrived on Zimbabwe soil alone was enough to get them deported. Oh my goodness. The US is really something, pretending to be so virtuous and such a leading example of democracy across the world, when all it really does is travel around the globe, destabilizing other countries. So let's get back to the presidential communications officer. Okay, so he had said that the failure to timely report the presence of the team on Zimbabwean soil was enough to get them deported. And in addition, understating the number of people who had arrived in their country meant that there was no politeness to be expected. He said, and I quote, "The state will invoke its rough hands in order to enforce the law of the land, and also to get that foreign country to respect the sovereignty of Zimbabwe." Oh my God. Zimbabwe is not playing with America. He said that the American governments and its agents are advised that Zimbabwe is determined, capable, and prepared to deport as many unlawful missions as other countries would choose to send into that country, including, quote, mighty America, end quote. He said that that message had to go out clearly and carefully to all countries, including America. He said, and I quote, "The size of the country, the military of that country, the economic might of that country, the diplomatic might of that country is absolutely inconsequential when it comes to the sovereignty of Zimbabwe," he said of this country, but the sovereignty of Zimbabwe and the need to preserve it. And that Washington, D.C., was determined to modify its strategies with respect to interfering in Zimbabwe's election after their preferred candidate in the most recent elections was defeated. Okay, because the current president was reelected, and clearly the American government is not in favor of this president who clearly is not playing with the American government. This presidential communications officer further said that the team's mission was clearly political, even though America has no stake in Zimbabwean politics, the same way Zimbabwe has no stake in American politics. Where's the lie? He declared that America must respect Zimbabwe's sovereignty and refrain from interfering in its politics. And then let me quote this. I mean, they are not playing with America. He said, if America thinks it has a holy mission to refashion the politics of Zimbabwe after its own image of democracy, they are out for a very rude awakening. That kind of meddlesome politics would not be countenanced in Zimbabwe, that Zimbabwe is determined to frustrate them, to stop them in their tracks until they realize that, quote, American political dreams are the preserve of American people on American territory. They do not overspill into the continent of Africa or the country of Zimbabwe. The post-election politics of Zimbabwe are an issue for Zimbabweans. They are not an issue for Americans, and they are not an issue for American experts, least of all USAID. On February 10th, two members of the Navanti team met with a former representative of an organization that opposes the current president, and one of the members of the US team who participated in that meeting expressed the US's interest in funding opposition counselors. So the United States sent people over there to meddle in Zimbabwe's politics and to try to drum up support for those in opposition to the current president, who clearly has no time for American foolishness and clearly is not interested in converting over to the American way or allowing America to shape politics in that country, as he should not be. Like he said, America's interests are over here in America, and it is the interest of the Zimbabwe citizens what happens in Zimbabwe. And he said, make no mistake about it, in so many words. And this presidential communications officer also clarified the Zimbabwe government's perspective that the US was engaging in, and I quote, desperate efforts carried out through US aid to rescue and remake the political opposition with a view to influencing the elections in 2028. And he said, and I quote, it will not happen. See, everybody's on to America now. Those days that were spoken about in that book, The Economic Hitman, where America would send people surreptitiously into African countries, foment opposition or support opposition, and effectively engage in regime change, support coups in those countries when the existing presidents would not fall in line with American policy. We all know about it now. So those days in many countries in Africa are over. They are not intending to fall for American meddling in the political environments of their country. So, of course, the US officials had to put their spin on it. And in this case, it was the United States Department of State spokesperson who angrily reacted to the deportation, claiming that members of that team were subject to aggressive handling, prolonged interrogation and intimidation, unsafe and forced nighttime transportation, overnight detention and confinement, and forced removal from that country. Which, what else would you expect when you have sent a team of people into that country to try to undermine the elected president's regime in that country and to try to support opposition to that president in elections that are to come 4 years down the road? And you thought they were going to what? You didn't tell them you were there. When you did realize that you were being followed and they were already on to you, then you reported that you had sent a team in, but you didn't report all the people who had come. The team that was there was on the ground meeting with all kind of opposition leaders. And you expected what? For them to roll out the red carpet, the United States, and welcome you with open arms? No, they were ticked off. And as that presidential communications officer said, they were going to use the rough hands of the law to deport that team and to force the United States to respect the sovereignty of their country. I don't see any problem with that. The problem that I see is with what our country did over there. They've been meddling in Zimbabwe's politics and imposing sanctions all the way back to Robert Mugabe. The article ends with the US Department of State spokesperson claiming that that team had been legally admitted into the country of Zimbabwe. And as we can see throughout that entire article, it's just not true. And I think that points up another thing about the US and something that they use over here on American citizens. They just keep saying whatever they're going to say over and over and over, regardless of the fact that it's absolutely contrary to the truth of what has transpired. Now, we heard the entire article about how those people snuck into the country. The US failed to report in advance that they were coming, as is required by international law and protocol, that the US Embassy only reported that half of them were there after realizing that they were being followed, and did not even reveal that all of them were there. And now the US Department of State spokesperson is claiming that the team was legally admitted into the country. It's just not true. And it's just indicative of how America operates. Do whatever you want and then tell the lie afterwards. Maintain your innocence after you have committed all kind of scandalous, unscrupulous, and often illegal, usually illegal activities. And they got people thinking that we Black folk are the biggest dangers in this world. No, ma'am, and no, sir. Okay, so all of that happened in February, right? Guess what the US did after that? They imposed new sanctions on Zimbabwe. See what I'm saying? Do something wrong, get caught, be held accountable for it by the people you wronged, then claim, lie about what you actually did, and then turn around and punish the people who caught you trying to do them wrong. Unfortunately, that's how the US operates, and they always have. And the only difference now in the age of enlightenment is that we're all aware of it. And so the grounds for the US imposing sanctions on Zimbabwe was corruption and human rights abuses. And that order that the US issued imposing the sanctions also affects other senior leaders in that country, blocking their assets in the US and barring them from all unofficial travel into the country. And these sanctions replace the previous sanctions that were placed on the country. And the White House said in a statement, the White House in America said in a statement that, and I quote, "We continue to witness gross abuses of political, economic, and human rights." The White House also complained about the targeting of civil society and severe restrictions on political activity in Zimbabwe, saying that that stifled fundamental freedoms while key actors and government leaders siphoned off public resources for personal gain. Sounds familiar to me. Sounds familiar in terms of the kind of economic activity that's happening in this country with regard to money being funneled over to Ukraine. Sounds exactly like what most Americans think is going on with regard to our money. And the White House claims that those illicit activities are contributing to a global criminal network of bribery, smuggling, and money laundering. The hypocrisy of it all, the hypocrisy of this government never fails to astonish me. But anyway, that all of this activity is leading to impoverished communities in Zimbabwe, Southern Africa, and other parts of the world, as if the United States really gives a darn about poverty in Southern Africa and so-called third world countries. And the US Secretary of State had the nerve to refer to multiple cases of abductions, physical abuse, and unlawful killing in Zimbabwe that had left the people living in fear. It sounds to me like exactly what the United States is doing to its Black American citizens, leaving them living in fear. And it is clear because there's been a pretty significant exodus of Black Americans out of this country into Africa, into Mexico and the Caribbean, into Europe, into wherever they can go to get away from the climate of fear that has been created in the United States with respect to them by those same kind of activities the American government is accusing Zimbabwe of. If I'm wrong, check me on it, because I don't think I am. As the next and final clip I'm going to show confirms, as I mentioned before, the US first began imposing sanctions on Zimbabwe in the early 2000s, targeting former President Robert Mugabe, who basically took Zimbabweans' land back from the European colonizers that were in possession of it and redistributed it to his citizens. And the United States has been up in arms ever since. As a matter of fact, back 12 or so years ago, when I traveled to Zambia, there was a time or an opportunity for us to travel into Zimbabwe by way of bus to visit that country. And our friend who was from Mozambique and traveling with us told us not to get on that bus and go into Zimbabwe because the Zimbabweans were very angry at Americans because of the sanctions that had been imposed and that were crippling their country. Now, of course, I understand that they were unable to separate the US government from US citizens. So we did not get on that bus and we did not go to Zimbabwe because of our country's meddling in that country's politics, trying to get somebody in there who's going to toe the line that America wants towed instead of leaving that country to be the strong, sovereign nation that it is and wishes to remain. And then I'm sure it comes as no surprise that various other Western countries, including the UK and the European Union, have also imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. And again, both of these articles, when taken together, highlights the absolutely corrupt, immoral, and illegal, that means criminal, actions of the United States with respect to Zimbabwe. And then when they get found out and kicked out, and when the Zimbabweans insist that America will not govern what happens in their country and needs to mind its own business because Zimbabwe is not interested in becoming a miniature America, then they get upset and they impose sanctions on the country, and their bully buddies over in Europe impose sanctions as well. And the current president has made clear that it is those sanctions that have been imposed on Zimbabwe for the last couple of decades that has crippled the country economically. Now, the one thing I will say is that I know that a number of African leaders are very brutal when it comes to how they deal with citizens who don't toe the line that the current regime wants towed. Okay, like Jammeh in the Gambia and other, he's gone now, but other African leaders can be very severe with their citizens when they are acting in a way that is in opposition to the current government. So I will not speak on whether there may be human rights abuses in Zimbabwe under the current political regime. But as I noted, it seems to me that contrary to the assertions of the White House and the US Secretary of State and all the spokespeople for America, America engages in activities that are very similar with respect to individuals who do not comply with what the current regime, be that, I don't want to take it too deep, but be that the actual government or what some call the shadow government and the alphabet agencies want. If you don't comply, they're coming after you. They're coming after you and trying to destroy you in the media. They're coming after you and some people are disappearing. They're coming after you and they're crippling you. So I find our country to be very hypocritical. And although it's mind-boggling what they have done over there in Zimbabwe, the reality is it's right in line with the things that they have been doing. As I pointed out, they're going to do what they want to do, twist it, and pretend that they're in line. The team was legally admitted into Zimbabwe when the country's officials are clearly telling us that that is not the case. America is going to do what it wants to do twist the narrative to support whatever it's done and keep on marching. And that's what we're dealing with. And that's why people and countries all over the globe, truthfully, don't like us. They just don't like us because of the things that our government is doing. And it would be nice if they could recognize that our government is not doing what we want it to do. I just made a video saying vote them all out because they don't care about us and they don't care about what we want. And they keep acting in ways that are directly contrary to what we, the citizens who have elected them, want. Anyway, that's it for my rant. Let me know, family, what you think about what the United States has done and is doing in Zimbabwe. As always, I'm very interested to hear your comments, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And until then, no matter what kind of shenanigans our country is getting up to across the globe, I'm wishing all of you peace and love and light. See you next time.
Please like this video and subscribe to the channel.